Okay, so I think it's time, and I'm here today to talk to you about Node.js, what's next. A little bit about myself before I get started. I'm Michael Dawson. I'm the Node.js lead for Red Hat and IBM. And what that means is I get to spend a lot of time working in the community. I'm on the technical steering committee, involved in a lot of the working groups, and it's really great that I get to spend so much time working to help build Node.js itself. I also work with the OpenJS Foundation, who's the sponsor of the conference today, on the CPC, and help with the work on that side too. On the other side, I also get to work with some really great teams within Red Hat and IBM who are either deploying Node at very large scale, working on products to help make Node be deployed more easily, or just to make sure that Red Hat and IBM are really good partners for working with you on Node.js deployments. So for example, I get to work on the same team that Beth, who was talking about, Beth, who talked to us just before this talk, and extendedly working with other teams like the Infinispan team. I'm reachable on Twitter, GitHub, or through LinkedIn if you want to follow me in any of those. So just to give you an idea of what I'm going to talk about, I'll start about talking about who decides what's next. So before we look at what's next, how does that sort of get into play? I'm going to talk about following what's next. Instead of just saying, hey, what's next right now, I'm hopefully want to give you a little bit of an insight into how can you follow it yourself. And so, next time, next month, you can actually see what's next if you want to be able to do that. I'll talk about the next 10 effort, which is making the next 10 years of Node.js just as successful as the first 10. And I'll go into a fair amount of detail on that. I'll spend some time looking at features, what's new, what's interesting, because that always seems to be of interest to people. And finally, I just want to end off touching a little bit on the supply chain security, because that's something that's really top of mind for lots of people in the open source world today. So first of all, who decides what's next? Is it the technical steering committee? Nope, it's not the technical steering committee. So we don't sit around there and say, yeah, this is what's going to go in. It's not like a company where we have like a dedicated budget and we tell people what to do and that's what they work on. So is it the companies that support the OpenJS Foundation or let their people work in the project? Nope, it's not that either. Well then, how about is it like, does an individual contributor just decide what they want to do? Not that either. So who does decide what's next? Well, in this case, it's really all collaborators, and it's together in real time, and we don't necessarily have a predefined roadmap. That's because unlike a company where there's somebody who says, well, I'm paying all these people, I'm going to decide what they do, it's very collaborative, and there's lots of different people involved, whether it be people from companies or individual contributors. And it ends up being driven by the doers. So it's the people who come up and do the work. So if you have something that you want to see happen, the best way to make that happen is to come and do it. It's also useful to open issues and say, hey, like I have this requirement, because we want to hear that from end users. But things are driven by the doers, so you need somebody who says, yeah, okay, I agree with that, I see where it's going to be able to do it. I also think we got to give a lot of credit to our reviewers and approvers. It's often just as much or more work to review and approve PRs than it is to actually create the PR itself. So we want to make sure that we acknowledge they're a really big part of what actually gets in. And then finally, we do want to, the project does work to provide support in terms of like, what do we think is important? What are the strategic directions that we want to go? So I say it's supported by our project's documented priorities. And those are a lot of the things I'm going to talk to you today about. So we'll start out by first looking though at, well, how do I follow what's next from the ground up, and how can you do that if you wanted to do that? The first thing you can do is you can follow GitHub notifications. The Node project is really great in that it's really strongly focused on being very transparent, inclusive, and making it so that all of the stuff that we do as much as possible is publicly visible. So if you go to GitHub, all of the information's there, the discussions, the PRs. But if you've ever seen one of those legal shows where the defense lawyer says, well, I demand you give me all the information you have, and then the DA sends over a truckload of boxes, and there's the information that they really wanted hidden among all that stuff. Well, GitHub can feel a little bit like this. This here is like a very late day. I probably didn't check for 2 days. If you go for a week, like when I come back from this conference, there'll be like 1,000 or 2,000 unviewed notifications. And so while all the information's there, it can be a lot of work to stay on top of them. And it takes a fair amount of time. I try and clear this inbox every week or twice a week, but that actually takes a lot of effort. So it's not my sort of recommended way to keep on up with what's up. The next one, which I think is better, is to, especially if I have a particular interest, is to get involved and keep track of the working groups and teams. So we have a calendar. So on nodejs.org/calendar, you can see when all the meetings of the different teams and working groups are. And so, for example, if you have an interest in releases, if you have an interest in tooling, if you have an interest in Node API, in build, there's a working group or team that gets together and talks about those topics. And that's really a great way to figure out what's going on and what's going to be next. We also similarly have assessed strategic initiatives, and these are things that we've agreed are important, we have a champion for, and we get regular reports on progress at the Technical Steering Committee. So this is a good thing to take a look at and say, hey, do I have an interest in one of these? Maybe reach out to the champion, and you can understand and get involved and sort of see what's going to happen or what's next on that front. I'll go more detail on Next 10, so I'm not going to talk about that right now. But the final one is releases. You might ask, well, releases, the features are already out there. But I think, as Beth mentioned, there's a good number of people, and I always recommend for people in production to stick to the LTS releases. So if you've been on the current LTS, there's actually maybe 2 releases, the last current and the new current, that you're going to be moving up to. So if you want to keep up to track with what's next, you can look at those releases. And we have a very well-defined release schedule. Every April, we have a new current. Every October, we have a new current. And in October, the current from April is promoted to LTS. So you know when those releases are coming. We also have a lot of Semver minor and Semver patch releases in between. All of those have a great change log that give you information in terms of what are the notable changes, as well as the full list. And so by keeping up to date on those particular release blogs, you can have a really good idea of what's coming to you if you're not automatically moving up to the latest release. You'll know what's coming when you do choose that next LTS release. So having gone through all those other things, let's now take a closer look at the Next 10 initiative. I think everybody can agree Node.js had a really successful first 10 years. And actually, it was his 13th birthday just last week. So maybe we're a little bit late here calling this Next 10. We started, maybe a year and a half late. But the goal is to say, let's make the next 10 years just as successful as the first 10 years. But how do we figure out what that is? As I said, there's no sort of, the Technical Steering Committee isn't telling everybody what to do. We don't have any one company which is like saying this is the direction we're going. So how do we bring the whole project and community together and figure out what's going to make us successful in the next 10 years? And actually, when we started to get together to talk about that, we realized we actually needed to understand some fundamentals before we could start doing that. So we first started to look at saying, well, what are the technical values and their relative priorities within the project? Because that's going to influence what we need to do and how we're going to do it. We need to know what are our constituencies. So what are all the different groups of people in the ecosystem who use Node or contribute to Node, and what are their needs? And how does that all fit into us being successful going forward? So we went through and we brainstormed, we came up with the priorities, and you can see here that, the relative priorities is, developer experience is right at the top, but also keeping things stable so we don't break too many people, making sure we can do things like logging and problem determination, making sure maintainers enjoy working in the project, and then finally, making sure we're up to date with, APIs. So do we have relevant APIs? Do we have things that the developers want to use? Not that any one of these priorities trumps the others, but this gives us sort of a context in which to make some decisions in terms of what we'll do or how we'll do them. We also looked at the constituencies. You can see that ranges all the way from direct end users, obviously, but also considering security practitioners. So there may be people within your companies who have to sign off on your application, who do scans. What should we be doing to make sure that when you go to deploy your application, they say, yeah, everything looks good, versus, whoa, you're not doing that, right? I don't have time to go into these in detail, but that was sort of the baseline that we needed to set before we actually started to look at some of the more technical things, which is probably what most people would be interested in. So the next step is we went through and we identified the technical priorities. Now we have this list. The key thing I want to say before that is this is meant to be a living list. So this was what we agreed at the time were the technical things we need to focus on to be successful going forward. But this should evolve over time because Next year, the things that may need to be done could be completely different. We have things like modern HTTP, suitable types, not necessarily TypeScript, but using types is something that's, very important. Documentation, there was a good talk this morning in the keynotes, how documentation is very, vitally important to a project in a lot of different ways. WebAssembly, ES6, basically up-to-date support for JavaScript features. Observability, permissions, security policy, having a clear security model so that when we interact with people reporting vulnerabilities, we can do that efficiently and have a clear agreement on, like, this is what we will consider a vulnerability, this is what we won't. Better multi-threaded support, single executable applications, and then support for the latest ECMAScript spec features. So we start by getting agreement, like, these are the things that we think are important, but okay, now what do we need to do? So what's next in the project on these? Are we doing the right things? How do we do that? So what we've done, and we started doing, is we've held a number of mini summits, and each of those we spend 2 hours on each topic, and we dive in, and really the questions we ask are like, what is it that's important on this topic to the success of Node.js, and are we doing it or not? And if not, like, how are some concrete next steps that we can take to actually move things forward? So back in last year, in November, we had one on suitable types, single executable applications. In January and April, we went into modern HTTP and documentation, WASM, and the security model. And the Collaborator Summit, which follows the main conference days this week, we're going to do ESM and observability. So if you're sticking around for that, I'd really recommend or really ask that you come and help us do that. These mini summits were not just for core collaborators. They were for anybody who was interested in that topic, has expertise. So for example, the one on types, we had people from the Definitely Types project. On WASM, we had some people from the WASM project come in because we want to get sort of that broad experience and expertise to help us figure out what we're supposed to be doing. So if you want to see specifically, because I won't have time to go through the details in each one, what we actually agreed in those sessions, we actually contributed a number of docs. In the Node repo, there's a docs contributing section, and that's where we added some documents to capture what we think now is our sort of strategy going forward. So we have one for maintaining types for Node.js. We have some additions to maintaining HTTP. That was a really interesting one, I think, because in that session we agreed we needed like a high-level HTTP API as well as a lower-level one with more control that you could maybe tune for performance. And I think that was one of the enablers for getting fetch in, because soon after that discussion, people worked on an implementation, pulled it in, and I personally think it was a really good illustration of getting together to agree on what's important can help enable people and make people feel, more willing and able to jump in and actually make those things happen. And that's kind of the goal, one of the goals of this. We have maintaining WebAssembly and the security model strategy. So if you're interested in diving into the details there, you can go to those docs to see, what we discussed and what was agreed. So how can you join in and help, to make sure the next 10 years of Node is successful? So again, it's, we need all of the ideas, we need all the input from all of those stakeholders that we had. So, you can come and join the effort. It's open, we meet every couple weeks. The meetings are on the calendar, you can find them, and there's an X10 team, just like I said, so you can join and help us do that. We've done some surveys. We got some really valuable feedback on the constituencies and their needs. We'd actually missed a few constituencies, and we got that feedback, so you could help by filling in our surveys. And then finally, you could help by supporting those key initiatives. When we say we need to do single executable applications, if that's an area that you're interested in, have expertise, you can actually jump in and help with the implementation. For example, on that one, we've got a proof of concept implementation that I did a little bit of work on, but now we've got some other people jumping in and saying, hey, well, actually, we should do this, or here's something that we did. And that's exactly what we want to foster, is getting that broader experience into pushing those initiatives forward. So let's make sure we get together and make the next 10 years just as successful as the first. So that's a little bit about what's next. So now let's take a look at, features. Before I get into features, I think Beth touched on this a little bit, but like major releases, why are they always so boring? This one was maybe an exception. But it's because, unlike sort of a product from a company, we don't save up all of our features and release them in one next major release. Like we have an approach where we want to get those features into people's hands as fast as possible so they can try them out and give us feedback. And so by the time we have a major, there aren't any new interesting features because they're already available in previous releases. And so the December minors are where it's at. You always want to be looking for those December minor releases, finding what's new, trying those things out, and the only downside is it doesn't make it as good for those press releases when it's like, woo, you know, the next version is out, but we've only got the things which, you know, we considered were breaking, and most of the time that's just for a safety purpose. You know, we try to avoid like things that we know will break a lot of people. It's like, here's an edge case, we'll make it December major. So in most cases, it's got a bunch of things that we don't think will actually affect anybody. But I still say it's a great time to party and to talk about all the recent features, as well as, you know, when we make a new major and when we do a promotion to LTS. So it's like, okay, let's talk about everything. So I'm going to talk about a few features, but they're not going to be just what's in 18, because it's what's been recent is what's interesting. Of course, fetch was one everybody was interested in. It came in 18. At its simplest, you can do you can get your HTTP request in as simple as you can in these 2 lines. We've had lots of good feedback, which is what we want. We released it as experimental because we know that we're going to get feedback, and experimental lets us adjust a little bit. Some people, it's like, it's too close to the web standard. Other people, it's too far from the web standard. So, of course, we're trying to find the right balance. Since, as people have mentioned, we're not a browser, so we can't be exactly the same, and it may not be appropriate to be exactly the same. We've got to find what that right balance is. The other one, another one that was in 18 is the experimental test runner. This is one where if you have, you know, sort of a low level of test requirements, so it's not meant to replace Jest or Mocha, which are great projects in the foundation as well. But if you need a simple test runner and it lets you avoid an additional dependency, you know, we've seen a fair amount of talk about dependencies and the risk that that brings. This test runner will let you write some tests and execute them without requiring any other dependencies. I like it because it uses tap, which is a nice standard output. If you've been working in the Node environment, you'll be familiar with that. There's tools to convert tap to other things. So really, it's a nice test runner, and will probably look pretty familiar to you. ECMAScript support isn't new, came in 14.17. You know, big change. Node had a module support system, CommonJS, for a long time. Unfortunately, the ES6 modules that was standardized is different, and actually different in ways that actually, it makes it, you know, it's not a one-for-one mapping even, you know, asynchronous versus synchronous. And I won't go into the details because probably everybody knows a fair amount about that, but it's something that's important and the project continues to prioritize and do work on. You can see that in every release we have additional support. So for example, in this release we had JSON import assertions. You don't need a command line flag to import JSON modules. There's experimental support for HTTPS and HTTP import modules. And there's also some very important work on some larger initiatives that you know, are very important because ES6 modules bring with it some changes and challenges to things like debugging and problem determination. So we're trying to work around some of those things, and like Jeffrey here, sitting up here, is working on loaders, and diagnostic channel is another effort. To be able to let you do similar things with ESM that you could do with CommonJS in terms of tracing transactions, problem determination, and all that kind of stuff. So there's still lots of important work going on that front. Every release comes with a new version of V8. In fact, if you're moving up to an LTS, from an LTS, several versions, keeps us up to date with the latest JavaScript features. So really, in terms of our technical priorities, that's one I think we're doing the best on. We keep up to date with latest JavaScript features because they come with that V8 engine. We also get you know, new interesting performance improvements generally over time. OpenSSL 3, this came in actually in 17. This is probably one of the biggest things that will actually impact people. OpenSSL is actually meant to be backwards compatible. So you know, for a good number of people, you won't see any impact. But it is one that I think has the bigger risk in terms of it's a major change in the OpenSSL implementation. We've seen problems and reports related to performance. So I would recommend that you actually spend, or you plan to spend a bit more time when you're moving up to 18 than you might have to other releases to do performance testing and to validate things. Like any OpenSSL update, you know, security continually, as computational power increases, they continue to sort of raise the bar in terms of what's considered a secure key size, what secure algorithms are. And like any other one, it drops a number of algorithms. And I think Beth mentioned a command line option that you need to enable if you want to use some of those legacy options. So this is one which is good. We needed to do it. OpenSSL 3 is the version that's going to be supported. 1.1.1 will go out of support before the 18 goes out of support, so we need to move up, but it is one to sort of keep in mind when you're looking at doing an upgrade. There's been a bunch of work on the stream side of things, so there's a bunch of new experimental methods on readable streams. I won't go into those, but just to show there's good work going on there. Another one I think is a little bit interesting, because I've even run into it, is that Node.js used to just always give you IPv4 addresses if that was returned by your DNS resolver, even if there were 6 and 4, and it gave you the 6 ones first. Now it actually will give you it in the order that the DNS resolver returns you. So if it gives you the IPv6 addresses first, it'll respect that and give those to you, which is generally what you want. The only thing is if you have sort of like a half-configured IPv6 machine that makes it think that you can support IPv6, but you don't actually have it configured all the way, and that's where like I ran into that doing some testing. It's like, yep, the machine thinks it can, but it can't, in which case you won't be able to connect. And so there is a nice, easy -- DNS result order. You can default it back to the IPv4 first if you want to do that. So easy workaround, but one just to keep in mind. So that's what I wanted to say in terms of new features, what's next. I just wanted to sort of finish off on supply chain security. I think there may be a talk tomorrow, but there was a talk today as well in terms of dependencies, the risks, and the OpenSSF. The OpenSSF, we're very grateful, is providing some funding and sponsorship to the Node project. That's because Node was at the very top of the criticality list. And that funding is helping us to work on our triage, fixing releases. As with any open source project, things that have a hard deadline are a challenge for volunteers, because open source projects are largely driven by volunteers. And most people volunteer when they have time. Even if you're working for a company, the company usually has some things they want you to do, and then they give you some time to work on open source and very much support it. And I work at Red Hat, and we have very good support for working in open source, but it's still not I'm just going to drop everything else when something comes up in the project necessarily. So it's really great to have some resource that basically that is their one job, to triage those vulnerabilities, help with releases. That's really great. I do at the same time want to say many thanks to our existing triagers. We have a team who rotate. They take 2 weeks at a time. It's, I think a group of about 6 people. We also have some companies who have stepped up to actually commit their people's times as security stewards. And like if there's a security release, that's your top priority. So that we need to develop more and more of, but the funding from the OpenSSL Foundation is good to help us with the day-to-day, staying secure, getting the releases out. The larger aspect, though, is that we want to use the expertise in the Node project to document processes for use in other projects and sort of share the expertise, both that we developed through this, but that we already have. I think we have a lot of good processes. Sometimes it's maybe documenting them and then maybe just sharing them. We also are going to focus on some of the dependencies. Node bundles in a set of dependencies, so we're going to start working on how do we make sure we know when, say, CVs are reported in those dependencies, so that we can, as opposed to having people come to us and say, hey, there was a CV reported in this particular dependency, and we're like, oh, okay, we didn't know that. Let's go see if we can talk to the dependency, get some information. Is it an issue? Is it not? Let's make sure that when that happens, we say, oh, yeah, we already know about that, and we're working on it. That does happen a lot of the time, but we want to get more programmatic about making sure that happens. Related to that, the Ecosystem Security Working Group has sort of been revamped and is now working on a number of these initiatives. That's where the discussions on a security model is. We want to better define a security model, as well as looking at the dependencies and like what should we be doing for dependencies. So if you have an interest on that area, as I said, project tries to work in the open, transparent. That's one of the working groups you can get involved in, help contribute your expertise, and move that forward. And at a broader scale than Node, at the OpenJS sort of level, there's a security collaboration space that was announced earlier today that is going to focus on sort of the broader JavaScript ecosystem and what can we do to help all the projects in that ecosystem sort of up-level their security stance. So that's what I wanted to say in terms of sort of what's next, what's new, some features, and the supply chain security. I'm not sure how much time we have left, but I'm open to a few questions if there's some time. Everybody's still awake, I hope. Okay, well, thank you very much, and we'll see you at the conference.